Oh, everybody, thank you for your patience. I'm so sorry. We had a technical glitch that I was not smart enough to figure out how to fix. Finally, I reached somebody for help. So I appreciate your patience. It looks like we still have most of you on. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Shawn Morford. I'm the Executive Director of the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils. And up until today, we've had really good luck being the moderators for various webinars, and really glad that you joined us. Most of you have probably been involved in a webinar or two, so you know how they work. But let me just mention a couple things if you haven't heard it. Normally, everybody is muted on these webinars, but I'm going to see if I can unmute everyone. And I would ask if you could mute yourself when you're not talking. We don't want to cut anybody off from speaking when you want to. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute folks. So when you have something to say, you'll be able to say it. So in just a second, I'm going to hand it over to Bala. There's a couple of housekeeping things. One is you will be unmuted, but you also have the ability to type a question in the question box, and I'll be watching for questions, and I'll look for a moment to interrupt Bala with your question. You can also raise your little icon hand, and that will alert us to the fact that you want to ask a question or make a statement. This is a little bit different than our normal webinars because it's a smaller group, and most of you know each other already and have had a chance to interact already with Bala. But we're happy to provide the format for your discussion, and I know I've seen a number of the slides that Bala has put together, and I'm sure it's going to be a really engaging discussion. We do have 4 poll questions that we'll be launching as Bala goes along, so you can be watching for those. It helps him get a sense of where you are in the discussion, and so you can be watching for those. So Bala's going to introduce himself. He's got an amazing background. If you haven't had a chance to interact with him yet, we are so lucky to have him engaged with the Watershed Council community. So I'm just going to hand it over to Bala, and he'll get started here.
Good morning, everybody. There we go. I'm going to present some insights today from a fellowship study. But first, a little bit of background about myself. About a year ago, I retired after 30-some years at Intel in a corporate-wide role. And the focus of my tenure towards the end was all about technology development and industry partnerships. In fact, managing a portfolio of technologies as an investment for Intel in advanced development and industry partnerships. One of these technologies, USB, we can all relate to, where I was the initial team lead and co-inventor and stayed with that over 3 decades of evolution. And as you can imagine, from your own experience in the watershed, substantial infrastructure, standardization, and enabling an adoption take years. And 5 years was kind of a benchmark for most of these technologies to take roots and become relevant to the user. In particular, the establishing of industry standards often have hundreds, sometimes up to 1,000 companies collaborating. It's non-trivial, given that these are also companies that are competing in the marketplace. To enable and have industry conversations, developer forum would typically have 5,000 attendees, and the memory and IO technologies that I was leading were cornerstones of industry presence for Intel. So since retiring, I've been hosted by BEF as an Encore Fellow. It's a social venture partner organized program, and specifically to support 4 mid-Willamette Watershed Councils in the aspect of capacity enhancement. So in today's talk, I'll follow the here. A brief background about the scope of study, what was it that I was looking at, and some general observations that go with that. A framework, a systems framework for capacity to anchor the discussion today, and in particular the leadership roles, the relative roles for the board and the ED staff, where they build up each other's capability and support. And in the framework, we look also at opportunities for capacity enhancement. Where can watershed councils grow their capacity, and what would be opportune given the restrictions on the structure and uh, forums available to you? I'll in particular go down two areas. One is the case for outsourced services. What are the benefits and what are the concerns that we have? And use accounting outsource as an example. And the second area I'll go deeply into is the aspect of relevance as it comes to engagement, the brand, equity, and fund development, and how these lead into resilience from the institutional perspective of the charter of the organization, and wrap up with a few recommendations. Uh, as Sean said, you are all welcome to pop in with your questions. In fact, I'd like to solicit that as we go along. So a little scope here of my study. I'm going to use the metaphor of a 100-year institution, analogous to a human lifetime. And as we know, men come and men go, but the river goes on forever. The old man river keeps rolling along. And all of us in the watershed have grassroots functionality, community-driven value to perpetuate the watershed. And the Oregon watersheds are in the second to the third decade of maturity. You can think of them as going beyond adolescence and teenage years into adulthood. And that might be a good metaphor to use as we examine three aspects of capacity, where there are existing strengths that are cornerstones for the organization and where there are opportunities to go beyond as we set up from our real world experience and prepare for the decades ahead of relevance to the community. So I wanted to make an emotional connection here to start with, using the analogy, the metaphor I started with. And as I observe in the last few months of working with you and participating with the councils and the EDs, it's very clear that there are multiple areas where significant capacity has already been gained. The mission and the sense of place of who you serve and what services you offer, the congruence of your practices with those missions, the partnerships that you have established in your regional areas between each other in the watershed and also with your municipality, soil watershed, land trusts, schools, and other partners. The data that you have been accumulating, especially through the model watershed on science, and the accumulated wisdom that you have gained along the way, all are significant. And yet, as we look ahead to the decades, especially with climate change, with new challenges that you are likely to have to take on, some questions come up. Reserves is one of them, and the capacity of many councils have periodically been drawn down to where perpetuity becomes a challenge, compounded by funding restrictions along with the charter that you have of not being able to tax or raise funds more flexibly. Engagement areas of the board to supplement the competence of the ED. And as you look at representation of who you serve, being able to equitably address the needs across all constituencies. And we will look at some of these today as opportunities for us to enhance capacity further. So I'm going to use a time-tested paradigm to bridge from a human capacity to an organizational capacity. Over decades of work, a well-tested human psychology study has lent credibility to examine what motivates us as humans. And in the industrial era of how motivation was dealt with, anything that's repetitive, monotonous, that lends itself to algorithmic work, the assumption was that the reward system would be extrinsic, that rewards and controls, the carrot and the stick, would be the way to get consistent performance and output. And it's very clear as humans, that's not how we work in our daily life. And we all know that intrinsic motivators are much more persistent and effective compared to external ones. As examples, we all spend hours learning a musical instrument where there's no financial incentive at all, and time goes by when you're in the groove. We often trade off lucrative jobs to become social servants, teachers, nurses, aid workers, or such as you are doing nonprofit work in the watershed. Extrinsic work often becomes addictive because you're looking at stuff to fulfill your sense of purpose or your sense of accomplishment. And these addictive things are short term, they evaporate, the cycle repeats itself. Money, power, title, they're all transient. Intrinsic motivators, on the other hand, such as the ability to be resourceful, independent, and have autonomy, to strive to become your best with the 10,000-hour commitment to gain mastery, and your own higher North Star of purpose that keeps you grounded and motivated. These lend to self-esteem, interpersonal relationships, well-being, and they are persistent. And in particular, such purpose drives meaning and inspiration. So a little link there to a Cliff Notes version of the book. It's a very readable book called Drive that goes into this. Um, your local library should have a copy. So building off this metaphor as we look at organizational capacity, the questions that come up are, what's the equivalent of capability where you are self-sufficient and you have autonomy? Where can you gain mastery of operations, practices, procedures, such that you're efficient, consistent, and have systems in place? And what would be your need to serve where you can focus on that mission? Are you relevant? How relevant? Where can you be more relevant where you aren't? And why so? And how can you address it? So some of these questions are well grounded in your mission statement already. And many of your strategic plans look at this in terms of examining your capability and relevance. So now I'm going to pass it on to Sean for a quick poll question.
Okay, it looks like folks are voting. Okay, it looks like about half. I'm going to go ahead and close it. It looks like 56% of you said that's me, and 44 say I'm well past there, and nobody said they didn't get it.
Oh, good. Good to hear that. And the reason I popped that metaphor, as I said, is this is a transition phase where some watershed councils are making that transition and some have just made it. And so the collective experience that you have, especially as you share those experiences through forums such as the NOWC and other partnerships, are very valuable to get to the next level of relevance. I'm now going to go into the systems view and propose the framework. And in the classic Intel style, Andy Grove, our CEO, used to pop up a 2x2 model. A lot of things in life lend well to a 2x2 examination of looking at a horizontal and a vertical axis. And in this view, we have the 4 areas: horizontally, strategy being matched with the business of running a nonprofit, and on the vertical axis, having the operations aligned with your programs. And I'll speak a little bit about how this lends itself to examining capacity. So as we look at strategy, the question to ask is the one I just posed, which is relevance. What are the needs? What purpose is to be served? Who cares? And what does success look like? That's part of your strategic plan. And then do you have the ability, realistically, how ready are you on all fronts? Can you deliver to meet those needs in a predictable and sufficient manner? In other words, do you know where you are, where you should be, and what's the path to get there? And if the path isn't clear, your strategy needs to include some pathfinders as well to explore what the direction would be for you to get from here to there. And that's a philosophical place to be in strategy. You're trying to set yourself up in the sense that we used for humans and organizations of having the North Star and the steps and priorities to go with it. Then when we look at operations, you need to have internal systems in place for functions that are baseline. Examples would be accounting, contracts, communication, event handling, fundraising. You need to have all these subsystem functions in place as part of your operations. And you need to have the efficiency so your return on your investment of time and money is well matched and optimized and affordable. And that goal of excellence requires continuous improvement. So operations need to include a way of examining what you have been doing and how the best known methods might be that you can start adopting. And we will spend some more time talking about this. The business side of it is all about goodwill. And your brand is part of that. You need to have broad and deep connections with your community, your partners, your funders, your networks. All of that lend into recognition of your capability and accessibility to your community. Along with that is the charter of a 100-year institution that the council has and the fiduciary responsibility that the board has for perpetuating the organization. So the question would be, does your community like you? Can they get close enough to you? And do they want you to succeed? Is it in your mutual interest? And the last area is the ability to scale programs, because that is where you have impact. You all have been working well over the last decade or two in terms of project planning and implementation of restoration. And additionally, there's been significant work done in the watershed, in the science area of monitoring, academic research, outdoor schools, and so on. And you have to ask the question, is your capacity delivering the results to go with your charter? So the horizontal axis ties the strategy to the business, the vertical axis ties the operations to the programs. And we will talk a little bit about each of these areas in terms of essential council capabilities. This is just to drill down into the next level. And you will see 3 pillars here. The first pillar, the essential capabilities are in the realm of alignment of needs and your clarity in your mission, strategy, and planning, your leadership in terms of how it is perceived externally, what experience do you already have bringing in, do you have the external credibility, do you exercise good judgment, and how are you in terms of interpersonal, both within the council and with your community at large. And do you have the relevance metrics, continuous improvement mindset in terms of how the program is designed, and your ability to evaluate that as well? And do you have the frameworks to handle change and resilience as the demands evolve? So that's the first leg of the tripod. The second is management of finances in terms of having good systems, policies, and checkpoints in terms of how things are uh, managed, controls, and analytical tools in terms of things that can be consumed by the board, presented to your grant agencies and your funders, and used in terms of improving your strategy. Then the composition of the board itself and the responsibility that it has to handle at a fiduciary level, the networks that the board has, and the priorities that you're establishing. The development of funding flexibility at the infrastructure level. Do you have the baseline capability in place um, for fund development? And that could be an area of investment in itself as capacity building. Do you have the diversification of funding sources? Do you have enough human capital as part of your resource pool? And what's your measure of stability in terms of reserves and cash flow? And the last aspect of brand has ongoing challenges in terms of marketing, social media and web-based communication, and engagement with your community. So that's the second leg of the tripod. The third leg is, do you have sufficient critical mass of core resources? And to the extent you don't have it in-house, how do you augment? Where do you get outsourcing help? Where can you partner? Do mergers look likely on the horizon? And where can you draw on pro bono support and volunteer help? You look at your human resources in terms of job design, your staffing, your development plans for your staff, how they are paid in terms of benefits, meritocracy, and equity. And then I won't dwell much on the other stuff which you all know about, right? Baseline capabilities, again, in information technology, being able to use things that are easily available as tools, and web-based as well as in person, and being able to handle your fiduciary checks and balances, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, where you set up your contracts and insurance. So a quick second poll question, and then if there are any questions coming up, Sean, from the audience, I'd like to kind of field those as well.
I'm sorry, I was muted there. Yeah, the poll is launched. It looks like so far, well, we don't only have 10% voted, so I'm not gonna, I won't say yet. Okay, I'll wait just one more second and then I'll close the poll and we'll post the results. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it. And there are the results. The vast majority, you must be kidding. 29% on a good day, I'd like to give it a try. 14% say glad to take it on.
Very interesting, right? And I'll elaborate a little bit here. None of us learn how to do all of these things coming out of any training, right? Most of these are learned on the job. And most of our staff in the watershed have a background in ecology, um, all the other things to run a business, to run a nonprofit, and especially to run a nonprofit in an Oregon watershed require many soft skills, many technical skills, many experiences that are very specific to your watershed even, or to the community you serve. And those are ongoing. But the baseline capability is largely similar across all nonprofits. And I would say most watershed communities as well have similar baseline needs. But what you enjoy doing and what you have to do are part of the challenge in the poll question. On some days, you would say, well, something that has to be done is something I don't mind doing. But the motivational factors that want you to come to work, what you were trained for, and where you can get someone else to do a good job, a better job where they are trained to do it, is part of the capabilities that we should be looking at. So the challenge then is to look at what is the relative roles of the board and the ED. We can't be the one-person band. I'm imagining here Bert in the Mary Poppins movie. On a good day, right? All of you are asked to do that. And the question is, in terms of leadership, where can the ED get the board to lead, and where should the board expect the ED to lead? And the 2x2 framework that I had put up earlier says that in the area of strategy and business, the board should be driving. The board should be leading. That's the horizontal dimension. It is the charter of the board to set council direction and priority. And part of the challenge of the board is to augment board skills to support the ED. And in particular, these four areas, finance, legal, communications, and HR, are valuable skills to have in the board constitution, in the board representation. And these resources don't have to be a lawyer or a CPA or HR specialist. You just need to have the ability to draw on these skills as you need it and support the ED in that space. The other dimension of operations and programs clearly should be driven by the ED and staff, leveraging your training and experience. And where you need to augment capacity with prudence, the council should look at all alternatives. Can you look at pro bono volunteer help? Where do you outsource? Where can you partner? You don't have to do it all internally. And in particular, things which drain motivation, where you struggle, uh, versus where you get the organizational energy, where you can achieve your best results, those should be part of your capacity building priorities. So I'm going to a little deep here in one area which may be opportune for you to supplement your capacity in, and that is the area of outsourcing. Uh, Historically, outsourcing and offshoring have been given bad names, right? Because the expectation is you go to some place just because of cost. But there are many benefits of outsourcing. You have someone who is trained to do that job well. You have choices in terms of getting that outsource from competitive bidding. Each of those service organizations that is providing an outsource service has self-interest to be the best, to provide customer service, and to retain retain you as your client. You get the benefit of consistency because that's what they're doing all the time. And like anything, when you do it again and again, you get better at it. When you do it for multiple accounts, multiple clients, you get the ability to learn from experience across teams. They can staff and provide you continuity and resilience in the service that you may not be able to command locally. As we said earlier, things which you don't enjoy, which someone else enjoys, help your staff morale. And there's cross learnings from the body of outsourced partners because they learn from each other. So what concerns come to mind are valuable to reconcile. The most significant when we ask outsource agencies is ignorance, as in, I've not thought about it, I don't know what it's about, and therefore I will assume that I don't have an opportunity to go down that path. You are disinclined to even start considering it because you don't know much about it to start with. And getting educated about it is the first challenge to overcome. Cost affordability become another. Um, the concern that many of the outsource agencies are set up to serve larger organizations at higher price points and more sophistication. And much to the contrary, there are many, the majority, 90% of NGOs have budgets of $1 million or less. And the space where you are in with budgets of a third to a half to maybe up to $1 million is well within the space of where outsource organizations are staffed with missions to serve you, especially nonprofit organizations. A third concern would be, will it be efficient or will it be taxing for me as opposed to doing it in the way I've been used to doing it? Will the responsiveness be sufficient when I need service quickly? And again, these organizations have a charter to help efficiency, not just in terms of their service, but also in terms of your time. If not, they don't have a value to offer. And just like any program management where you work in the watershed, you get to tell them what you need. They get to meet you halfway. It's not their job to take away your control on your data or your relationships. They want to support you and help you be successful because that's how they succeed. And the particular concern of this is going to be a little hard in transition because change requires effort, requires commitment. That is again something that they have seen time and time again as outsource providers. They realize that that is something they need to help you with. And they are there to provide the extra help and training and skills and tools to go with it. So if you think of outsourcing as adding capacity, and what it does is lets you focus on your core competency, then you should be considering it. Now, I'm going to look at one particular example of an outsource opportunity. But before that, let me look at a quick decision matrix to help. How would you navigate? What would be opportune to consider even for outsourcing? And again, a 2x2. What things do you love doing? And what things, hate's a strong word, but do you grind your teeth about? But you do it anyway. On the other axis, what things do you struggle doing? And where do you completely rock it? Obviously, if you rock it and you love doing it, you would want to keep doing what you do best. So let's check that one off. On the other dimension, if you struggle and it's not something you enjoy doing, of course you should get help and you would want to outsource it to someone who likes doing it and does it well. On the other two dimensions, if you like doing it but you still struggle, it probably means you need to augment because there is more demand and you can't do it all. So maybe a staffing opportunity or potentially an outsourced contract opportunity. And if you do it well because you've learned to do it, but it's not where you start and end your day enjoying something, maybe something that you could shift out and supervise and free up your time. So uh, with that framework, you can examine lots of opportunities for potential outsourcing, accounting being one. But you have already looked at program management as potential outsource that you already do well. Communications, managing your website or your social media streams, engaging volunteers and outreach, fund development, grant applications. I mean, these are all places where there could be outsource opportunities where the work gets done with all the benefits I described and frees up your scarce resources to be more engaged in your watershed and provide more equitable opportunities that you may not be addressing today. So accounting in particular comes to mind. It's a baseline functionality with multiple levels of criticality. Fiduciary, first of all, you have to maintain good accounts, ones that will pass audit and not get you in trouble. Uh, you need to look at your license structure. It helps you with your strategy formation. It helps you with your funding ability because you get credibility when you have good financial reports. It helps you with your cash flow and overall with resiliency. So any one of these would be good enough reason to examine your accounting function. And outsource services are fine-tuned to go across ledger management, grant management, and tax filing, and vertically integrated to support nonprofits. They have cloud-based capability team structures where it's multiple people with backup, cross checks between themselves, supervision and in-house training, and they seem to be fine with either flat fee or hourly rate structures. So the expectation going down with something like this is A, it gets done efficiently and consistently. B, you don't have situations where your bookkeeper moved on or your tools have a hiccup or you need to get around to it at a time when you can't afford to do so because other priorities get compromised. And to the extent that it is done efficiently, professionally, your ED gets supported in multiple ways. You get board reports in a timely fashion. Budgeting and budget tracking becomes part of the routine, a monthly, quarterly, annual. The time beat that goes with it. Your reimbursements get submitted and handled quickly and expediently. And your reserves, you have visibility in terms of building those because your accounting systems give you better insight. And in particular, supporting the board with goal setting and health monitors is something that, as an ED and as a board treasurer, you need to be able to read good account statements. You don't need to be able to create good statements. There are outsourced agencies that will do that for you. So a quick poll question then.
Okay, it looks like most people have weighed in, Bala. Let me close it and then I will share the results. No one has never tried outsourcing. 63% said they've tried one service and 38% said they've tried multiple services.
Excellent. Good. So you've thought about it, you have experience doing it, and the question is, would you be willing to examine other opportune areas for all the reasons we talked about? Now, I did not mention shared services, but they have many of the attributes of outsourcing with a few challenges that go with the shared model. Someone needs to initiate it. You need to get commitment across everybody. There's management overhead that one of you has to take on. There is question of equitable service, challenges with performance management, all the things which contracting and outsourcing address. So with that, let me go into the last area I wanted to bring up today. And that is the big question of relevance, right? Watershed councils have purpose. There's a relevance relative to who you serve and what services you provide. And the three areas of developing your brand where there is recognition and empathy, and people can understand why you exist and care about it, supplemented by engagement, which is building of human capital and social capital in your watershed, and then finally supplemented by fund development such that you have diversification, given some of the restrictions that you work with. If you work equally across these three, they build on each other. And the virtuous cycle model is especially valuable because you have a sense of place and a personal relationship that you can build with the knowledge that you can actually work face to face and people know who you are and you know who they are. So the brand development starts with your competence and what value you serve. Can you articulate the problem statement, what solutions you offer, and how much impact you deliver? Can you do so on your website? Can you do so in your annual newsletters? Can you do so in presentations you give at your council meetings? Uh, as you look at partnering and collaborating, you should be thinking about furthering your brand in the messaging and in the event so that you have equal share as co-partners. When you look at your web and social media, is there clarity and conciseness where a fifth grader could look at it and understand what you do? Are you credible with the testimonials and case studies that you're able to offer? Can you gain empathy and convey hope in terms of why someone should be supporting you or care about your existence and how do they relate to it? We all know that humans think in metaphors and learn in stories. In your watershed, what stories do you tell? What metaphors do you use? What testimonials can you harvest? All that is part of your brand development. Then when it comes to engagement, you need presence and participation. We talked about human and social capital. Drawing on that capital in your watershed gives you resources. You have a diversity of stakeholders. Are they all finding your services and your capability accessible? And engagement typically is a path to developing donors. When people start doing things, they come back. The third or fourth time they start working monetarily or in terms of skills they have. A path to board service builds on engagement. And finally, development of diversification. At the board level, you have lots of networks, personal contacts, ability to develop major donors, and make them shareholders and heroes to support your cause. Sponsorship is another area of fund development. How do you get public or private sponsorships, but without compromising your brand or letting it getting usurped, where the value you provide is the reason they're willing to sponsor your cause? And finally, allocations from municipalities, from taxing districts, from land trusts, all of you are doing so. But asking for more of the same should be part of this virtual cycle, such that you have resiliency from diversification of funding sources. And the more people care about your brand, the more they engage, and the more there's a virtual cycle that will help overcome the ups and downs, right, the speed bumps with other funding, lumpiness, and help you also with fewer restrictions in this part of the cycle. aspect of your financial model. So growing unrestricted budgets is one part of it. Can you do campaign to replenish your reserves? Um, and in summary, a quick poll.
Okay, this should say, can you relate to the cycle? There's an extra D there. Yes, I'm already there. I can see the potential, or something seems missing. Okay, I'll go ahead and close it. Looks like most folks say that they can see the potential. 2/3 say they can see the potential. 17% say they're already there.
Very good distribution. So right down the middle. Thank you. So as we wrap up, a few thoughts. Right, strategy and business needs to be board driven, owned, and supportive of the ED. And the ED and staff should again dedicate their time towards growing relevance. So the capacity model with the 4 quadrants, each of those is an area to build. Growing your network of stakeholders in the watershed and pragmatically outsourcing baseline services should both be conversations with the council, with the board, and with the staff. And how do you get from engagement to fund development to grow your human and financial capital to build resiliency? And how do you develop your brand such that all constituents are served and maximize your relevance? So these are the topics we talked about today. It was a little rushed because we were starting a little late, but some feedback since you're all here. Any comments, any questions that would be relevant to address today?
Feel free to unmute yourself and just ask, or if you want to type a question in, I'll be happy to read it. I've got a question, Bala, for you, maybe while people are thinking about what they want to comment on. I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg question around board development. And, you know, a lot of folks get on boards and they don't come with a lot of experience. They have maybe a passion for restoration, but not experience as board members. So a lot of times the executive director ends up playing the role of board development. And maybe if you could just comment on that cycle where the executive director ends up being the secretary for the board, or not the secretary, but the capacity building for the board, and how a board can become self-governing or self-motivated to take care of board issues themselves. How do you, as an executive director, sort of help launch that? Do you have any insights on that?
So there are three parts to that question that come to mind. The board should have a session where they evaluate themselves as part of a board function, including tenure, understanding why they are serving on the board and for how long, what skills on the board, and how they plan to supplement those. So a recruitment plan and a path to building board perpetuity has got to be part of board strategy. Right, so an ED could call that. Maybe you have to get consultants to help the board navigate that, but that should be part of the board function to start with. The second is, to the extent that you have identified limitations in functional areas that the board should be self-sufficient in, you need to go recruiting and find those skills in your watershed and bring them on board to serve the community. And the third dimension is just good board practices. And there is plenty of material online. The NOWC, other organizations can provide that as board trainings. And the board should periodically, I would say once every 3 years or so, go into a board training workshop. It could be intact across multiple watersheds or at a conference kind of setup. But I've gone through these many times and found it invaluable. But starting with the board self-examination and self-audit in terms of your capability, your gaps, your learnings, and how to serve that role better would be the place to start. The rest of them are just skill gaining, right? As the ED has gained skills, the board too can gain skills, first by supplementing the board and then training intact.
Thank you. You mentioned the network. One of the things that our board has identified in our new strategic plan is that our audience, the people that we serve, has tended to be coordinators and executive directors for the most part. And in our new strategic plan, we've really identified boards and board chairs as an important audience. So I think there's recognition that executive directors and coordinators need help sending that message. Sometimes it's better coming from someone else other than the executive directors to say, hey, this is what a self-governing board looks like. And this is what board best practices are. So I hope that in the coming months and years that we can help provide support to boards. I've got
Yes.
question, unless anybody else wants to jump in with and unmute themselves. I'll just go ahead and ask it, and then I'll, go ahead. Suzanne, I see you unmuted yourself. You want to jump in? Not hearing you. So let me just launch ahead, and Suzanne, you can interrupt me if you want. So I'd be curious, maybe this is a question for everybody on the call. We've talked about outsourcing, and of course, one of the questions that comes up is, yeah, well, that's great, but how am I going to pay for it? You know, every dollar we get has to go to, you know, pay for my salary sort of thing. So we can't even imagine outsourcing. I'm wondering how many watershed councils historically have done what I would call bartering. You know, so I've got expertise in grant proposal writing and somebody else has got expertise in the finances, and we barter our time. So it's kind of hour for hour based on the expertise I might have and somebody else might have for me. So it's not so much a contractual relationship where I'm paying them, but maybe it's an hour for hour exchange or something akin to that. Has anybody on the call been involved in that? I'd love to hear if you have. I know, Rob, I know that you guys are doing a shared model. I'd love to hear how that's going. Kristen just answered and said, no, we have never done that. And Suzanne, I see you said your mic's not working. If you want to type something in, I'd be happy to read it. Yeah, so anyway, maybe that's just something that we can begin to think about as we reflect on the wisdom that you're bringing, Bala, is how can we outsource to each other so that we keep the, you know, keep the green internally, as it were. Yeah. So some questions are coming in. How to outsource staff positions maintain a sense of place? If outsourced position is not based locally, is that an issue? And then Rebecca said, we share information with one another, not so much skills and time, but information, certainly. So the question about how do you deal with a sense of place?
So your face, right? Your presence is local, and the ED would love to be that, right? To be actually there in the community, to actually engage with landowners, with education, with municipalities, with funders. That's the mission of the ED, right? To run the programs, to bridge the fundraising with the opportunities to serve. But the baseline capabilities that you're talking of outsourcing are orthogonal to the sense of place. They are things that you have to do to run any NGO, not necessarily a watershed nonprofit organization. And to the extent that there are nonprofit service providers that are doing this virtually across the nation, some of them serving hundreds of nonprofits, literally, um, and able to do it remotely, virtually, in the cloud, um, and efficiently. They're able to bridge the gaps that you would otherwise be trying to do on the job. And the way I describe it, Sean, is an opportunity cost, right? There is the real cost of, yes, there is a cash flow, but there's an opportunity cost of what you would be prioritizing your time against. And the vertical dimension, right? The place where you have impact is in programs, not in operations. And operations are probably where you should be looking at outsourcing.
Right. We have one more question. I'm going to just jump in here. Suzanne was saying, my question was about the strategy, operations, business, and programs diagram. As the outreach coordinator, I see my program role as overlapping with the business role, the brand. Can you say something about where my staff role intersects with the board role in this capacity? So where does my job end and the board's pick up?
Right. So in the general structure, right, the ED works for the chair of the board, and the board's job is to support the ED, right? So obviously the ED counts on the board having their back, but the board also being there as a resource to supplement in areas that the ED doesn't have the life experience or the training. And the board is equally vested in the success of the ED and wants to give them all the resources, the things we talked about earlier, right? The autonomy, the ability to master things and to scale things and to have a purpose and what their mission of the board of the council is. And that level of vesting is the complementary partnership. And as I said, most of the councils here are working well after 2 decades, recognizing that that's where they need to optimize. And what we're talking about here is opportunities to scale further as you get from a 300K, right, organization to $500,000 budget to 3/4 or $1 million. And all of you have that potential of demand in the watershed. And as you get past the third of $1 million budget to the $500,000, you have sufficiency to have more than 1 or 2 staff members, right? You have sufficiency to have program staff. You have sufficiency to outsource even programs, leave alone baseline functions. And you have enough flexibility in your allocation of your budget to do justice to all the things that we talked about in those 4 quadrants, your strategy, your networking, your operations, and your programs. If you don't get to that about $500,000 stage, you are squeezing too hard, right, to survive. And that's where this capacity question becomes relevant.
I
hope that answered the question.
Yeah, just one more comment from Rebecca. She said we share information, and then she added information is oftentimes skills. So it's not just information, ideas, it's skills across. So
right, skills there, right.
Yeah.
And I see that also because especially where there are adjacencies in the watershed, EDs are engaging, right, to build off each other's experience and skills, and in some cases even across boards.
So another question about what's the next step? So you've got your recommendations, you've completed your assessment. What's the next steps for the councils?
Right. So the 2 areas I would stress are first for the board to have a self-examination in terms of the relative roles, and the second would be to have a conversation in terms of where the ED's time is best spent and what areas of capacity can be supplemented externally to build on what you have internally. And each watershed is in a slightly different place relative to the ED's prior experience and the board's constituency, and opportunities in the watershed as well, right, vary. So within that, I think examining these two questions would be useful.
Yeah. So, Bala, you may know that councils who have capacity dollars from OEB are required to do a board and organizational assessment. And I would say there's probably a wide variability across councils about how that is used. Some councils may administer them at a meeting and then never talk about them again, or use them for one meeting and talk about them. Others use them extensively throughout the year. And I would just love to hear from folks about how useful those are. Is it just something you check off for OWEB, or is it something that's actually provides a vehicle for discussion with you and your board? Just curious if anybody wants to weigh in. I'd say go ahead and unmute yourself if you want to add to that. Okay. Well, that looks like maybe about it, Bala, unless there's anybody else who wants to say anything else. Oh, here comes a question. Yeah, Kristen's responding to my question. Creates a useful discussion in the moment, but it's not referred to a lot after the fact. So there might be something that the network could do to support boards in this regard. We've got this tool, and since it's required to be done anyway, it might be something we could expand on with board training or board contact or information or something. It's something we can think about.
Right.
Yeah.
So this virtuous aspect of brand development, engagement, and fund development itself requires a strategy discussion. You need to have a strategy on how we're going to do this, right? That has to be a part of the council and board priority. And you should have a framework on how you intend to go about this. Where do you start? What do you currently have? Where would you like to be? And what do you need to work on to get there? And then you can figure out how it gets done, whether you bring in help, whether you do it in-house, whether you supplement your current capability at the board level, or build partners to do that with.
Mm-hmm.
But that strategy, I think, is very valuable to have as a discussion.
Yeah. One comment just came through. The board generally doesn't like doing the assessment. I assume we're talking about the OWEB assessment. Results are discussed, but not much else. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So some more things to take back.
Intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, right? It's an extrinsic motivator because it's required from OWEB. It's not something that comes from within. So, Bala, what
you need to do self-examination more than do a checklist.
Yeah. What are your next steps with this, with your fellowship and your engagement with watershed councils?
So of the 1,000 hours, right, for the fellowship assignment, I'm about 2/3 of the way there. A lot of it has been learning curve for me as well, and working with these councils. In one area, I'm looking a little deeper, which is the accounting outsource potential with some recommendations. And I might look at one or two others, depending on what you would like me to look at. And feedback on this presentation also would be valuable. Please let me know. You can ask for time, send me a note. Next time we meet, I'd like to get some feedback as well. Is any of this relevant to look further down the rabbit hole? And if so, I'd like to hear about it.
Okay, and our plan is to make this recording available on the network's website also. So if there are folks that you guys know should or may want to hear Bala's results, it'll certainly be available for people to have a look at. So I want to thank Bala and thank you guys for hanging in there almost a half an hour after we were going to start this thing. And hopefully we got the bug worked out so we won't have that problem again. Unless there's any last minute questions that I see come up, I'm going to just thank Bala and you guys for participating.
Likewise, thank you all. Thank you, Sean. Thank you for all the participants and appreciate the feedback, both the questions today and anything else you'd like to send my way. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, there's a couple of thank yous coming in from folks. So thank you, guys. We'll talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Have a great weekend.